quote at the beginning of chapter 15 is by Robert J. Gordon. It says, unfortunately, policymakers cannot act as if the economy is an automobile that can quickly be steered back and forth. Rather, the procedure of changing aggregate demand is much closer to that of a captain navigating a giant supertanker. Even if he gives a signal for a hard turn, it takes a mile before he can see a change, and 10 miles before the ship makes the turn. So, why do we have this quote at the beginning of this particular chapter? Well, as Keynesian economics became more popular, especially through the 60s, the general idea is that they were masters of the economy and they had it figured out and they could just manipulate things and make the economy do whatever they wanted it to do. Well, turns out that it didn't work like that. So they weren't as the masters of the economy that they thought they were. We've not had a history of being able to fine-tune the economy. We can guide its course sometimes, but as far as being able to fine-tune it, not so much. So, chapter starts out by talking about the past 100 years of economic fluctuations, and it gives you a graph to show you that. Here's the graph on the first page, section 15-1. And when you look at the graph, what's the good news about the volatility in the economy? Look at the right-hand side of the graph. What's happened over the past several decades? Yeah, the swings are not as large. It's not as volatile as it once was. If you look back here, in the earlier times, on the left-hand side of the graph, there's a lot of volatility there. So, more recent times, it's not been as volatile as it was. So, that's a good thing. Even the Great Recession here that you can see, that's nothing like the Great Depression. You see the world wars, you can see them with these large peaks. Over the past several decades, the economy is not nearly as volatile as it had been. And chapter asks the question, can discretionary policy promote economic stability? There's widespread agreement about the goals of macroeconomic policy. That is, almost all economists favor the goals of steady growth, price stability, and full employment. But the question is, how do we achieve those goals? And there's two different ideas. There's two different camps in this area. There's activist economists who believe that discretionary changes in monetary and fiscal policy can reduce the degree of instability in output and employment. There's also the non-activist economists who believe that discretionary macro policy adjustments in response to cyclical conditions are likely to increase rather than reduce instability. Non-activists favor steady and predictable policies regardless of business conditions. And so let's talk about some of the economists that we've previously discussed and try to put them into one of these two camps. What about Keynes? Yeah, he was very much an activist, wasn't he? What about Friedman? Yeah, he's a non-activist. In fact, one of the videos that we watch, it ends with one of the major sources of instability is us trying to stabilize the economy, something along those lines. I don't remember the exact quote, but trying to stabilize the economy is one of the number one sources of instability versus stability. What about Hayek? We watched that Keynes versus Hayek rap. Non-activist. So there's a lot of economists that fall into the non-activist camp. A lot of schools of thought that fall into that camp. Monetarist, rational expectations, supply-siders. But the Keynesians and Keynes, they're certainly activists, and there's a large number of economists that fall into that camp, even though there's more schools of economic thought that fall into the non-activist side of this. Why is it that we have a problem fine-tuning the economy? One of these is a lag, and that sometimes creates issues for politicians. George Shultz. Anybody know who George Shultz is? Sometimes I have to ask things that people I'm real familiar with. Sometimes students don't know who they are. He was the Secretary of State for President Reagan for most of Reagan's term. So not all of it. It was the latter part of it, though, for a lot of it there. Maybe it wasn't the latter part. Anyway, it was him and James Baker, so I don't remember who was first. Anyway, that's who he is. His background was economics. And, he's talked about, an economist's lag is a politician's nightmare. So you're not going to get reelected if the economy doesn't respond when you do something. But if you ask the economist, they'll tell you there's going to be a lag. And there's actually 3 different lags. One's a recognition lag. The time period after a policy change is needed from a stabilization standpoint, but before the need is recognized by policymakers. So what's that talking about? Well, how did we define a recession? Yep. When real GDP is declining for, somebody mind letting her in, please? When the economy is declining, we have negative real GDP growth for 2 consecutive quarters. So how long is that in terms of months? 6 months. So we're 6 months into this before we recognize the fact that we're in a recession. So you're a ways into this before you even recognize that you're in a recession. How long do recessions generally last? How long was the Great Recession? Anybody know? But it started in December, and then I think it was June of the year, of the following year after that. So it was 18 months. And a couple of other severe recessions we've had since then, early 80s, mid 70s. Those were 16 months. Prior to that, the other recessions that we've had, they've been less than 16 months. Those are the recessions since the Depression. And so, how long is it going to last if you don't do anything about it? It's one of the questions. So, some economists say not that long. And they'll point to the recognition lag and tell you we're 6 months into it before we even recognize that we're in a recession. Also, there's an administrative lag, the time period after the need for a policy change is recognized, but before the policy is actually implemented. And so, what's that mean? Well, just because we recognize that we're in a recession, does that mean Congress is going to pass some legislation about it the very next day? Probably not. Are they noted for swift action or arguing about things? Yeah, they enjoy arguing about things. And that might go on for some time. And so we're 6 months into it before we recognize that we're in a recession. And then we're going to argue about it for possibly a number of months. And then Congress finally takes action. Does that mean the economy is better that evening? Or the next day or the day after that? No, it takes time for whatever action they took to actually take effect and improve the economy. And that's the impact lag. Time period after a policy change is implemented, but before the change begins to exert its primary effects. And so, just because Congress passes some legislation to try to help the economy, that doesn't mean that it's immediately going to be better. And so, what happens, according to the non-activist, is that if you look at the swings in the economy, what happens is we have our peak up here. That's the peak. But just because we're falling, did we immediately recognize that? No, we're 6 months into it before we have those 2 consecutive quarters of real GDP growth. So, got this recognition lag. We'll just say that we're right there. We're a ways into this before we recognize that we're in a recession. And when Congress starts to argue about it, put it right there. And here we have this next lag, which is the administrative lag. But what's happening here? We've already bottomed out with this one, right? So the economy was actually starting to get better on its own here. But what did they do? They passed some legislation to try to stabilize the economy. And then we would have gone here and they left it alone, but now they're trying to stimulate it, but it had already bottomed out on its own and it's going to, in the process of recovery. But they're trying to stimulate the economy. Impact lag. But now we're stimulating the economy, but what are we doing? We're making it the peak higher, the next peak higher than what it otherwise would have been. And in the process, what are we doing with inflation? We're creating inflation, overstimulating the economy. So then what do? We stomp on the brakes. Or we don't want the inflation. But since we stomped on the brakes, what happened? Well, it stepped on the brakes a little too hard maybe, and now it's worse than it would have been if we'd have just left it alone. And so a lot of the non-activists, they're just not supporters of trying to micromanage the economy, and they'll tell you that it would be more stable if we just left it alone and let it smooth itself out. We'll overstimulate the economy and then turn around and step on the brakes too hard. So basically, we're not masters of the economy the way some people would like for us to be. Hopefully we can guide it a little bit, but if we try to micromanage it too much, it'll actually cause more instability than stability. And of course there are those who are activists. I think we should be trying to micromanage the economy, but the debate continues. And why do you need to know this? Well, hopefully you can decide which camp you may fall into, and that will help influence who you'd like to vote for. So, and not necessarily what party you'd like to vote for. If you look at the Great Recession, what did President Bush do when he was in office? Stimulus. And President Obama, stimulus. So we had stimulus packages in the Great Recession under both Republican and Democratic presidents. Some particular candidates, if they were to win, they're certainly non-activists. So, for example, I'm just going to throw Rand Paul out there, who was probably the most non-activist of the current politicians. You wouldn't have likely seen him supporting any type of stimulus. So if you're not a fan of that, you should be looking for a candidate that's not likely to support it. Like I say, it could be in either party. So, but if you are a supporter of the stimulus packages, find a candidate that's likely to support them. There's an index of leading economic indicators, and it shows you this index over on page 298. And why do we call it a leading indicator? Well, if you look at the actual recessions that are highlighted, did the index of leading economics turn down prior to that? Yeah. So it moves before the economy. So we've talked about GDP. If you're looking at that, you're 6 months into the recession before you've got that data to tell you that you're 6 months into the recession. So the index of leading economic indicators is looking at other variables. It's the single most widely used and closely watched forecasting tool. The index is a composite statistic based on 10 key variables that generally turn down prior to a recession and turn up before the beginning of a business expansion. And so these are items that are useful to try to point the direction that the economy may be moving. The index has correctly forecast each of the 8 recessions since 1959. The problem, though, sometimes it turns downward and we don't actually have a recession. So you can get some false uh, pointing there. It points at a recession, and there's no recession that takes place. But it does tip you off if there's going to be a recession. Tells you that a downturn in the index, however, is not always an accurate indicator of the future. On 4 occasions, 62, 66, 84, and 95, a decline in the index of leading indicators forecast a recession that did not materialize. This has given rise to the quip that the index has accurately forecast 12 of the last 8 recessions. But if it does turn down, there's a good chance that you're headed towards recession. It's just possible that maybe you're not going to end up in recession. What's included in the index tells you over on page 299. List here. Length of the average work week in hours. So if there's a decline in the number of hours that people are working, might that clue you off that maybe you're headed for trouble? And if there's an increase in the number of hours that people are working, the economy is picking up. Number 2, initial weekly claims for unemployment compensation. That's going to be the leading part of what the economy is doing. Number 3, new orders placed with manufacturers. Number 4, percentage of companies receiving slower deliveries from suppliers. Number 5, contracts and orders for new plant equipment. Number 6, permits for new housing starts. Number 7, interest rate spread between a 10-year treasury and the Fed funds rate. Permits for new housing starts. Why does that lead the economy? Yeah. If you sought permission to build the house, got that permit to build, that means you're likely going to build. And has the money been spent yet? No, but are you expected to spend money and employ persons in the construction of this home, whatever it might be? Yeah. So that's going to lead the economy. Interest rate spread, that's sometimes, some economists follow the yield curve a lot. It has to do with that. Take a class in finance, you won't learn a whole lot more about that. Number 8, index of consumer expectations. We've talked about that one before, haven't we? Number 9, change in the index of stock prices. And then number 10, change in the money supply, and specifically room 2, which is something that we've also talked about, right? So these are leading indicators, things that might tip us off that the economy is either moving downward or expanding. What about computer forecasting models? Econometrics is increased in popularity over the years. If you're interested in economics as a profession, econometrics is increasingly becoming its own specialty. So if you're good at math and statistics, that might be something that you want to look at. Economists have developed highly complex econometric models to improve the accuracy of macroeconomic forecast. In essence, these models use past data on economic interrelationships to project how currently observed changes will influence the future path of key economic variables such as GDP, employment, price level, these things that we've talked about. To date, the record of computer forecasting models is mixed. Economic conditions are relatively stable. For example, when the growth of real GDP and the rate of inflation follow a steady trend, the models have generally provided accurate forecasts for both aggregate economic variables and important subcomponents of the economy. Unfortunately, however, have generally missed the major turns in the economic road. For example, none of the major computer models predicted the recessions of either 1990 or 2001. Neither did they forecast the severity of the downturn in 2008. And so they've had some success with econometric models, but they're certainly not perfect. And I like to compare them to the weather. If you watched the weather this morning, he probably gave you a 7-day forecast. Do you know from experience that that's likely to be better for today and tomorrow, maybe the second day out? But what about that 7th day that's out there on the forecast? Is that likely to change at some point over the next 7 days? It probably is, isn't it? What about if he was to try to give you a 14-day or a 2-month forecast? Would he be very accurate? No. He wouldn't be very accurate with that. So the longer the time horizon, the more inaccuracies they're subject to be in the forecast. These forecasts, they assume that everything remains the same. You know, does anybody watch the news very much? Is it that things mostly remain the same, or do you see these breaking news stories come up every little bit? Yeah, there's always breaking news. And did the econometric models take into account any possible breaking news that we're going to have? No, there's no way to know that. So, there can be changes that the model has not taken into account. What about, let's say that you studied the economy in the 70s, you came up with a great econometric model that described exactly what the economy did in the 70s. Can you take that and move it over here to the 2000s? Think that that's going to be accurate? Have we had structural changes in the economy since then? Yeah. And on the other hand, though, when you're doing statistics, I don't know how much any of you know about statistics, but do you want a lot of data points or just a few? Usually a lot of data points. Because you want a lot of data points, you expand your model to cover the last 100 years. Were there structural changes in the economy in the last 100 years? Yeah, we don't have the same economy now that we had 100 years ago, do we? It's changed a lot. There's been structural changes. And so, are these relationships going to be the same now that they were in the past? Probably not. So, when you move to the other side of that and say, well, I think there have been structural changes since then, so you shorten your time period down. But when you do that, what happens to the number of data samples that you have in your model? It's fewer, and the fewer with statistics, the less data you have, the less accurate you're going to be, right? And so, I'm not arguing against using econometrics, but pointing out that it's not perfect. And by the time you have a large data sample here, you may be experiencing some structural changes in the economy. So, are we ever going to be perfect with econometric forecasts like physics or a hard science, how they're able to predict something more precisely? Maybe not. So some economists want us to get to that point. But if I drop something and a physicist tell you very specifically and that it's going to always be the same every time, yeah, we know the rate that things drop at, don't we? That doesn't change. There's not going to be any structural change of some type that affects that. So they may be able to be more accurate than you're ever going to be able to be with econometric forecasts, which makes it more difficult to do these. Market signals as forecasting tools. Tells you that information supplied by certain markets can also sound an early warning that a change in policy is needed, for example, because they fluctuate daily and are determined by auction markets. Changes in commodity prices often foretell future changes in the general price level. And specifically, some economists will look to the futures market. Who knows what a futures market is? Anybody know what a futures market is? Yeah, well, there are some for stocks and financial indexes, foreign currencies, things like that of a financial nature. There's also agricultural futures and different futures for different commodities. For example, oil. And for example, if you're trying to forecast the Texas economy, the Federal Reserve Bank in Dallas puts out a Texas leading index. Since Texas is somewhat dependent upon oil for the economy, that's one of the variables in the leading index for Texas specifically, because especially West Texas, what happens in West Texas when the oil market falls? Yeah, that's pretty bad news for West Texas. They have an economy that's somewhat related to the oil industry. And so what do we do if we want to know at least what the expectations in markets are for oil? You can just look at what the oil futures price is. What a futures contract is you're making an agreement for future delivery of whatever this may be, maybe 3 months down the road. So if you look at the price and it's lower than it is now, maybe people were expecting a downturn. What if you look at the price in the futures market and it's higher than the spot price? Evidently, people are expecting prices to increase. Now, is that always correct? Do people that are trading in these markets have perfect information? Do they know what news is going to break in the next 3 months? No. Do they know if, for example, that a war might break out in the Middle East and they don't even know about it? Yeah, it's possible. And if something like that changes, is it going to change that market? Yeah, it's going to change it. But does it give you a good idea of at least what the participants in that market are expecting to happen? Yeah, it's good as a forecasting tool to help you have an idea of what the future may hold. But the point I was trying to make earlier, are there any economists that have a crystal ball that know what's always going to happen? No. Some are better than others, but nobody knows exactly what the future holds. So be careful when you start looking at econometric models. They may be accurate, and something could change to throw them off. So they're useful tools, but they may not foretell the future any more than a crystal ball will. Hopefully they're better than the crystal ball, but they're not always accurate. But it's better than nothing, isn't it? Many economists maintain that accurate forecasts of turns in the economy are beyond the reach of economics. Two major factors underlie this view. First, turns in the economic road often reflect economic shocks and unforeseen events. For example, discovery of a new resource or technology, abnormal weather, or political upheaval in an important oil exporting nation. There's no reason to believe that economists or anyone else will be able to predict these changes accurately and consistently. Thus, while economic theory helps to predict the implications of unforeseen events, it cannot foretell what these events will be and when they might occur. Second, the critics of forecasting models argue that the future will differ from the past because people will often make different choices as the result of what they've learned from previous events. Therefore, forecasting models based upon past relationships, including elaborate computer models, will never be able to generate consistently accurate predictions. And the idea here is that people learn from the past, hopefully, and they make adjustments based upon what they've learned. They have expectations, and there's a different ideas about how people adjust to their expectations. One model, and this was popular with Milton Friedman, would be adaptive expectations. It's assumed that decision makers rely on what has happened in the recent past as the best indicator of what will happen in the future. As conditions change, people will alter their expectations. However, under the adaptive expectations theory, there will always be a time lag before people will alter their expectations in response to changing conditions. And so, if you believe in that model, for example, if you increase the money supply, in the short run, you're going to see some improvement in the economy. In the long run, what are you going to see, though? Inflation. You're just going to see inflation. But in the short run, as people are adapting their expectations, you're likely to see some improvement. So adaptive expectations is one model. The next model, Robert Lucas was influential in developing it. It's named the Rational Expectations Model. And the outstanding economist for this chapter is Robert Lucas, who was born in 1937, won the Nobel Prize in 1995, generally given credit for the introduction of the rational expectations theory in macroeconomics. His technical work in the area has substantially altered the way economists think about macroeconomic policy. He's a longtime professor of economics at the University of Chicago. If you're interested in studying economics at the graduate level, especially if you're a non-activist economist, the University of Chicago is one of the leading places that you might think about attending. The rational expectations hypothesis is more complex than the adaptive expectations hypothesis. Under this theory, people form their expectations about the future on the basis of all available information, including knowledge about policy changes and how they affect the economy. According to this view, rather than merely assuming that the future will be like the immediate past, people also consider the expected effects of changes in policy. Based on their understanding of economic policy, for example, people may alter their expectations regarding the future rate of inflation when the government runs a larger deficit or expands the supply of money more rapidly. If people see the money supply expanding, they know that that's inflationary based on their previous experience. So let's look at how people may react to that. And let's say that you're going to give someone a loan. And let's say that you want to have a real return of, say, 3%. Let's say that you're pretty confident they're going to pay you back, and that's the real rate that you want to earn for lending your money, not spending it now. And let's say that in the recent past, inflation has been 2%. So, if you're just looking at the recent past, and it's been 2%, you're going to say, well, inflation has been 2%, so what nominal rate of interest do I need to charge? 5%. Add them together. Okay. Adaptive expectations. You can increase the money supply. People won't realize what's going on. It'll take them a little while. So interest rates aren't immediately going to change. And so you may see some positive effect in the economy. On the other hand, adaptive expectations. In the recent past, inflation has been 2%, but you're thinking about giving someone a loan. You also know that the money supply is expanding right now. And what do you know about what happens with inflation when the money supply expands? You have inflation, don't you? And since you know that, and you know that the money supply is currently expanding, you're going to make your best estimate as to what the future rate of inflation is going to be. And let's say that you're expecting it to be 5%. So, not because the inflation rate is 5%, but because it's 2% now, but you know that the money supply is increasing, you go ahead and plug in a 5% as an inflation premium. So now what's the nominal interest rate? It's 8% now. And when was that change? Down the road or just immediate because you knew that inflation was likely to increase in the future? It's immediate. It's not because inflation has increased, it's because your expectation is that it's going to increase. Based upon, you know that it's 2% now, you know that the money supply is expanding, you know that that creates inflation. You may not know exactly how much, but you have an expectation and you act upon your expectation. So because of your action of taking action based upon your expectation, what just happened to the interest rate? It went up. And so what we see with rational expectations is that the economy reacts quickly based upon people's expectations. And because of that, policy is to try to stimulate the economy. It's ineffective. You can't fool people. They have an expectation about what's going to happen. They form that expectation, and They don't wait to be harmed by the inflation. They go ahead and act. The rational expectations hypothesis does not assume that forecasts will always be correct. We live in a world of uncertainty. Even rational decision makers make errors, but they will not continue to make the same errors. So that's important that you understand that. People that speak against the rational expectations hypothesis, a lot of times they don't understand what it says. They think that it says that people always have perfect economic forecasts and always know exactly what's going to happen. It doesn't say that. The language of the model is people don't make avoidable systematic errors. So what's an avoidable systematic error? The easiest way that I know to explain that. What's that look like? A target? Anybody ever shoot anything at a target? Yeah. Well, what if you just shoot all over the target? Yeah. You're not hitting the bullseye, you're just shooting all over the target. You have some errors there. Are they avoidable systematic errors? You're just shooting all over the place. But let's say that you shoot at the target, and you just shoot a real tight group right here. Is that an avoidable systematic error? You avoid that once you identify that you always shoot a real tight group right here. You adjust your sights, can't you? Or if you don't have adjustable sights, could you aim right up here? And if you start aiming right up here, where are you going to hit? You're going to hit right there. So this is an avoidable systematic error. Once you've established where you're shooting at, can you avoid that? Yeah. So what the rational expectations model is saying is that people don't make avoidable systematic errors. Would you continue to aim down here if you knew that, well, I guess you were aiming here. If you continue to aim right here, you're always hit right there repeatedly over and over and over again. No, at some point you're going to aim right up here, aren't you? You're going to avoid this error that you're making. You're going to learn from your past mistakes. So you're going to avoid these systematic errors. So does the model say that you're not going to possibly just shoot all over the place because you don't know what's going to happen? Yeah, you may do that too. But those aren't avoidable systematic errors, they're just errors. And there's no claim that people don't make errors. We all know that people do, in fact, make errors. So there's two major differences between these two theories. One, how quickly people adjust to change, and two, the likelihood of systematic forecasting errors. And so those are the big differences in these. But if you believe in the rational expectations hypothesis, you're not going to be an activist. Why? Well, you can't fool people into the economy being better. People make immediate adjustments. The Phillips curve, this was popular back in the 60s. Economists thought that they could fine-tune the economy using the Phillips curve. And they identified this curve, and rate of inflation and unemployment. And so this was popular with Keynesian economists. If you're having some inflation, well, that's easy to fix. We'll undertake policies that run us down here along the Phillips curve, and we'll get rid of some inflation, but it will come at the expense of increased unemployment. We can trade one for the other, and we can follow this curve along and tell you exactly where we're going to be along the curve. Well, what happened? 1970s came along, and we had stagflation. Anybody remember what that is? We've talked about it before. It's inflation and unemployment at the same time. High rates of it, double digits. So, some economists thought that Phillips curve had gone away. Others said, well, it's not gone away. It just shifted out here. But either way, if it's constantly moving around, can you accurately hit something that's constantly moving? Going back to the target example, can you hit the target better if it stays still or if it's moving around here as you're trying to hit it? Hard to hit a moving target, isn't it? So, the Phillips curve, one of those lessons that maybe we don't know as much about the economy as we thought we did, and maybe we can't fine-tune it. One of the reasons for that, expectations, rational expectations. So, in the 60s, most macroeconomists ignored the potential impact of expectations. Instead, they believed that there was a direct trade-off between inflation and unemployment, that a lower rate of unemployment could be achieved if they were willing to tolerate a little more inflation. The view provided the foundation for the inflationary policies of the 1970s. As Keynes once noted, ideas have consequences both when they are right and when they are wrong. Beginning in the latter part of the 60s, both monetary and fiscal policy became more expansionary. The inflation rate rose to 3%, 6%, but the higher rates of inflation persisted. The unemployment rate also began to rise. As macroeconomic policy became even more expansionary, the unemployment rate dipped briefly, but it soon returned to exceedingly high levels. By the end of the 70s, the U.S. economy was characterized by high rates of both inflation and unemployment. Inflation in 79 was 11.3%. In 80, it jumped to 13.5%. So, high rates of both inflation and unemployment, or what we call stagflation. What went wrong? Given what we know today about expectations, this is not an easy question to answer, as both the adaptive and rational expectations theories indicate. The alleged trade-off between inflation and unemployment will dissipate once people anticipate a higher rate of inflation. Put another way, the Phillips curve is not fixed. It's not a fixed curve that's always going to stay in the same place. If it's not always going to stay in the same place, is it going to be easy to hit? No. You're shooting at a moving target here. The curve is moving around on you. Integration of expectations into the Phillips curve analysis indicates that there's no sustainable trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Expectations undermine the simple Phillips curve analysis of the 60s. So, again, the idea here is discretionary policy. It's ineffective. One reason put forth here, rational expectations. People have rational expectations of what's going to happen in the future. Again, do they have to always be right 100% of the time? No, they just have expectations, and because of that, they're going to take actions to protect themselves. And that's a rational thing for them to do. In contrast with the early Phillips curve view, the modern view indicates that if policymakers want to keep the unemployment rate low, they should follow policies consistent with low and a steady rate of inflation, one that people will be able to forecast accurately. And so, a more modern view of economics, we need stable, steady policies. What happens with expectations as you take wild policy swings and people don't know what's going to happen? Do they still form expectations of what they think might happen? Do they act upon what they think might happen? Even it doesn't matter if they're right or wrong. They'll have an expectation and they'll take some actions based upon their expectation. So if you have policy that's just widely swinging and people taking actions out there according to what their expectations are, is the economy going to be as stable as if you just had consistent policies that people knew what the policy was? Yeah, that's that right. It's not going to be as predictable. And so our policies, they need to be consistent and predictable. And then we won't have these wide swings that are created by changing policies. That people, again, they don't have to predict it right. That's not what the model's saying. It's just saying people react based on their expectations. Some areas of agreement. It's difficult to time changes in monetary and fiscal policy correctly. And timing is also always an issue. We might know that the economy is going to head downward, but when? Like the stock market, it was easy to predict the timing of the stock market, when it's going to go up, when it's going to go down. We'd all be billionaires. But is it easy to predict? No, it's not easy to predict. And one thing that came out of the rational expectations model by finance professors there at the University of Chicago, which is where the model was developed, the finance professors took that. Some of them won Nobel Prizes for doing this, but they took that and made it into the efficient market hypothesis. What's that say? Well, there's about 3 different levels of efficiency depending upon if it's the availability of the information that you're looking at. The idea is that people take information and they use that to make rational decisions about their investments, and because they do that, market prices are efficient. And what's the implication of that, and what is some of the research indicated, as opposed to going out and hiring a financial guru and paying him a lot of money to pick stocks for you? If you just hang the Wall Street Journal stock pages up on the wall over there and throw a dart at it, you're going to have just as good of results. So the prices are efficient. They've factored in the riskiness of the assets, and people purchase those stocks, and the price reflects what it truly accurately should be. And so, as opposed to hiring a financial guru, what should you do with your portfolio? You should have a good portfolio manager picking the right combinations for you, but as opposed to paying somebody a lot of money to pick out the correct stock, maybe you should be looking at a mutual fund index of all of the stocks, index fund that favors a particular, designed to mimic a particular stock index. Why? Securities are priced efficiently. So, and does anybody have a long history of beating the market by a great deal every year, year after year after year? You know, some of these guys are wildly successful one year, and then a few years down the road, they take this big hit because they were wrong. Something happened in the world that they weren't counting on to change things. And if you don't believe me, look at some of the famous economists and Nobel Prize winners that were at long-term capital management. I don't have time to talk about it now, but if you're interested, you can Google for long-term capital management. See what happened there. Number two, expansionary policies generate strong demand, and inflation will not reduce the rate of unemployment below the natural rate, at least not for long. Areas of continued debate: does fiscal policy exert much impact on aggregate demand? So is it successful if we have a stimulus? Two, during a severe recession, will an increase in government spending be more effective than a reduction in taxes as a tool to promote recovery? I mentioned earlier, the recent recession, you saw stimulus packages under both a Democratic president and a Republican president. They both wanted a stimulus package, so they were both being activists. But here's where one of the differences lies. How do we go about this stimulus? Should we cut taxes or should we increase government spending? So your feelings about that may influence who you may want to vote for. Number three, is economic instability the result of the natural tendencies of a market economy or the errors of policymakers? And we saw the Keynes versus Hayek route, and the fake mustaches and everything that those guys had. If you want to see real pictures of these guys, there they are over on page 308. And the rest of the chapter tells you somewhat about recent recessions that we've had and past recessions that we've had. It's pretty straightforward if you want to read through that. I will warn you, and it doesn't point it out in the text, and I don't know why, but this recent recession that we've had, does anybody know the cause of it? Briefly, financial crisis. It was created in financial markets. What about other recessions? Do they always come from a crisis in financial markets? No, some recessions have other causes. So if you take a recession that's created by a financial crisis, try to compare that to a recession that was maybe created by a shock in the oil market or something, it's comparing apples and oranges in many respects. They're different. So you can read through that, but comparisons between recessions from financial crises and a supply shock of some kind or some other reason. If you look back at really old recessions when the economy was more agricultural based, maybe it was a supply shock created by the weather. Maybe it was a drought that led to this. So should you be comparing droughts to financial crises? Not really. They're both downturns in the economy, but length and severity and all that stuff, there are different sources of crisis here. So I would caution you to pay particular attention to causes of these recessions. And they're both downturns in the economy, so there's going to be some similarities, but just keep in mind that there's different causes for recessions. So keep that in mind if you're comparing one to another. So, any questions about chapter 15?